assisting her teammates. Stephanie White says she's seeing the whole floor, doing a jump circle.
Here's Clark, guarded by Sherrod, finds Timson on the roll. She'll lay it in.
When it's to play fast, push the pace, as does Indiana.
Clark bangs all the way in and finishes. Here's Clark, working behind Boston. Has the switch on Reese, will fire, and hit from three. Cunningham looking for help, finds Clark. Clark to a wide open Harris, her three is good. And then Ty said, you know, Cece leaves me in awe. Said, I'm watching her some. Wheeling, found some space, didn't take. Finds Boston in the paint. Basis for this group.
Exactly that, making a big impact, bringing energy, bringing a spark off the bench, continuing to bring.
Finds Clark, back to Timson in the lane for the lay. Clark, guarded by Sherrod, will fire a bomb and hit. Off to Clark. Clark looking to work the lane on Pow, the left-handed finish.
Contacts, and guess what? They're sold out for Nike. I think they need to make some more.
Love that alley as Clark. Clark, guarded by Howard, an outstanding defender. Clark looking to separate, fading and hitting. She's 3 of 5 from deep. Clark through the lane, reverses it in.
We need to have a very serious conversation about what just happened in the Indiana Fever versus Atlanta Dream game, because this overtime victory contains multiple storylines that demand honest examination, starting with what Caitlin Clark accomplished individually, continuing through the best game of Michaela Timson's professional career, and landing directly on the coaching decisions and individual execution failures that turned a game Indiana should have won comfortably in regulation into a 41-minute fight for survival against an Atlanta team that was missing 2 starters. Let us start with Clark and the records, because they deserve acknowledgement before anything else enters this conversation. Clark finished with 26 points, 9 assists, and 3 rebounds in 41 minutes of floor time. She posted her 23rd career game with at least 25 points and 5 assists, a mark that now ranks 5th most in WNBA history. More significantly, this was her 12th such game in this single season alone, extending her own WNBA single-season record for that specific statistical combination. Over the last 11 games, she is averaging 26 points, 9 assists, and 3 rebounds, while shooting 50% from the field, 41% from three-point range, and 87% from the free throw line. That is the statistical profile of the most dominant player in this league. And there is genuinely no close second at this moment. Every conversation about MVP voting in the WNBA needs to be measured against this sustained 11-game stretch of elite production, because nothing being produced anywhere else in the league compares to what Clark is generating on a consistent nightly basis. Indiana picked up their 3rd consecutive victory against a playoff-caliber opponent. That matters enormously for the narrative about whether this franchise can compete at the highest level when the postseason arrives. 3 wins in a row against teams fighting for postseason positioning is not coincidental. It is the direct result of what happens when Clark is allowed to be Clark, and when the players around her contribute at any reasonable professional standard. Now let us talk about Michaela Timson, because she deserves her own section of recognition, and it should be enthusiastic. 20 points, 7 rebounds, in approximately her 3rd or 4th start as a fixture in the starting lineup, against Angel Reese, who has been discussed extensively as one of the premier interior presences in this league. Timson was dominant on both ends of the floor throughout this game. She imposed herself physically in the post. She finished around the basket with the athletic efficiency that her recent starts have been steadily building toward. She defended with positioning and competitive engagement that frustrated Atlanta's interior game across the full 40 minutes and into overtime. This was the best performance of Michaela Timson's professional career, and it came against a legitimate interior opponent on a night when everything was on the line. The coaching staff deserves genuine credit for the decision to put Timson in the starting lineup and for sustaining that decision as she has developed into a legitimate and meaningful contributor. That specific call has been paying dividends with increasing consistency, and the performance against Atlanta is the clearest evidence yet that Timson's presence in the starting unit is not a temporary experiment, but a competitive improvement that has real staying power. Now let us talk about Angel Reese and Atlanta's interior execution, because the close-range finishing in this game from the Dream side was historically problematic. Reese came into this game having shot 28% on layups over her previous 3 outings. She had a game going 1 of 13 from close range in that stretch, another of 3 for 13. In this specific game against Indiana, she shot 5 of 16 from the field, missing numerous close-range opportunities that should be foundational automatic conversions for a player with her size, her experience, and her professional development. Reese still recorded 15 points, 14 rebounds, and 6 assists to reach her double-double, which reflects the rebounding, hustle, and positioning that are genuine strengths of her game. But the shooting efficiency and the close-range conversion rate tell a story about a player whose offensive output relies heavily on second-chance positioning and volume rather than on reliable first-attempt interior finishing against competent defense. Timson's defensive performance was a significant reason that Reese's close-range attempts were as limited as they were. When Indiana's starting center is containing one of the league's most discussed interior players to 5 of 16 and contributing 20 points on the other end, that is a complete game that defines what a successful individual competitive matchup looks like. Allisha Gray was the genuine standout performer for Atlanta in this game. 11 of 24 from the field, 32 points, 7 rebounds, and 5 assists. Gray competed and produced at a legitimate level throughout this game and into overtime. Ryan Howard added 17 points in a supporting role. The Dream competed with real seriousness despite their personnel absences, which makes Indiana's inability to close this game before overtime even more frustrating given the competitive advantages Indiana carried into this matchup. Now let us address Aaliyah Boston and the close-range finishing problem that keeps surfacing as a persistent and damaging theme regardless of opponent or game situation. Boston finished with 18 points on 6 of 16 shooting, went 0 for 4 from three-point range, collected 14 rebounds, added 5 steals, and 4 assists. The rebounds and steals reflect genuine hustle, defensive engagement, and the physical commitment that Boston maintains even when her offensive execution is not meeting expectations. The shooting numbers reflect a player who has been progressively repositioned by the coaching system to operate further from the basket throughout this season, with predictable and documented consequences for her ability to finish the high-percentage interior opportunities that Clark's elite playmaking consistently creates for her. When Boston is going 0 for 4 from three-point range and missing close-range shots at the rate she has been throughout this season, this team goes to overtime against opponents it should control in regulation. That is not a hypothetical assessment. That is specifically what happened in this game against an Atlanta Dream team that was missing 2 starters. Boston at the rim is where the competitive gap in this game existed, and the coaching system that has moved her primary operation to the perimeter is a meaningful part of why that gap persisted long enough to require an overtime period. Until Boston's close-range finishing returns to the standard that her size, her skill set, and her professional experience demand, Indiana will continue to allow competitive situations that Clark's playmaking creates to go unfinished, and games that should be won comfortably in regulation will require extended play to decide. Now let us address Kelsey Mitchell and what happened with ball distribution and offensive design in the closing stages of this game, because it requires direct and completely honest examination, without the diplomatic softening that would misrepresent what the footage shows. Mitchell shot 9 of 22 from the field to reach 20 points. The consecutive 20-point game streak continues. Credit is due for the individual competitive consistency that sustaining any meaningful streak at this level requires, and Mitchell has been a genuine contributor to Indiana's recent victories. But 9 of 22 is volume scoring in service of a statistical milestone, not efficient scoring in service of optimal team performance. The difference between those two things became clearly visible in the fourth quarter and into overtime, when the implications were most significant. Throughout the fourth quarter and the overtime period, Indiana's offensive possessions were disproportionately directed toward getting Mitchell her scoring total, rather than consistently running the plays most likely to generate the highest quality offensive outcomes available. Clark did not attempt a shot in the overtime period. The player who had been keeping Indiana alive and competitive through her individual excellence over 41 minutes, the player averaging 26 points and 9 assists over the last 11 games, was not taking shots in the most important offensive possessions of the game because the offensive structure in those moments was oriented around maintaining Mitchell's streak rather than maximizing Indiana's competitive efficiency. This cannot be the organizing principle for a team that has genuine championship aspirations. Mitchell's consecutive 20-point game streak is a meaningful individual achievement that reflects real competitive consistency. But when the team's offensive design in the game's most critical moments prioritizes preserving that streak over deploying the player who is producing the most dominant individual performance in WNBA history at this specific point in the season, the priorities have been inverted from what winning basketball demands. The basketball community watching this game closely observed that Stephanie White ran repeated possessions through Mitchell in the fourth quarter and overtime, while Clark stood at the perimeter without the ball. That is a documented and observable coaching decision, and it carried consequences that showed up directly in the final score. Indiana needed overtime to defeat an Atlanta Dream team that was missing 2 starters. The reason Indiana needed overtime is meaningfully connected to the offensive architecture choices made in the closing minutes of regulation. The 3 consecutive wins against playoff-caliber opponents are genuinely significant and deserve real acknowledgement. Indiana has demonstrated over this recent stretch that when Clark is operating as the true engine of the offensive system and when the players around her contribute with reasonable professional consistency, this team is capable of competing with and defeating quality opposition heading into the postseason. These wins build competitive confidence, improve seeding position, and establish the kind of momentum that playoff basketball rewards. But the problems that turned this specific game into an overtime contest rather than a regulation victory against a shorthanded opponent are the same structural problems that will be amplified against elite postseason competition. Aaliyah Boston missing close-range shots, Kelsey Mitchell shooting 9 of 22, while the ball priorities serve her individual streak over optimal team efficiency. A coaching framework that removes Clark from the center of the offense in the most important competitive moments to preserve a teammate's statistical continuity. These are addressable problems. Timson starting and delivering 20 points and 7 rebounds in the best game of her career demonstrates that the roster adjustments available to this coaching staff are capable of producing significant competitive improvements. The question is whether the coaching staff will apply those adjustments with the consistency and the organizational clarity that playoff basketball demands, or whether the individual priority distortions that cost Indiana clean regulation wins will arrive unchanged in the postseason and encounter competition that punishes them without mercy. Clark carried this franchise through 41 minutes and an overtime period against an Atlanta Dream team that competed with real seriousness despite its absences. She produced the statistical line that extended her own single-season WNBA record for the specific combination of scoring and playmaking she brings to this game every night. She kept Indiana in a competitive situation that required overtime, partly because the execution around her and the offensive design serving her were not at the standard her performance deserves. 3 consecutive wins against playoff teams, Clark posting historic individual numbers again, Timson delivering the best professional performance of her career, and a coaching framework in the fourth quarter and overtime that oriented the ball away from the best player in the league in the moments that mattered most. Indiana survived. The winning streak continues. The postseason is approaching. What happens between now and the opening playoff game will determine whether the structural problems that turned a comfortable victory into a 41-minute competition get genuinely addressed before they encounter opposition that has no interest in allowing Indiana to survive through Clark's sustained individual excellence. The records are real. The wins are real. The problems are equally real. And the clock is running on how long this team has to solve them before the answers matter more than any of us are comfortable thinking about.